Welcome to the Wild Ag Podcast, where we'll serve as a connection point for landowners and conservation professionals who want to integrate conservation and agriculture. I'm Dr. Andrew Little, Professor of Landscape Ecology and Habitat Management and Extension Specialist at the University of Nebraska.
And I'm Nate Pfluger, Precision Ag Coordinator for Pheasants Forever and an avid outdoorsman with friends and family in my free time. Together, we'll work to bring you perspectives from both landowners and conservation professionals for discussions on soil, water, and wildlife in ag-dominated landscapes.
Welcome back to the Wild Ag Podcast. My name is Dr. Andrew Little. I'm here with my co-host, Nathan Pfluger, and we're looking forward to today's talk. It's going to be focused on wild turkey management in Nebraska. We have here Carlie Gizel, and I think actually that's your maiden name, so I'll let you kind of introduce yourself and tell us a little about your role and what you do.
Sure. Thanks for hosting me. I'm happy to be here. Yeah, so my name is now Carlie Gizel. This whole year has been slightly insane. I got married and finished graduate school and moved 3 times and started this position. So, been eventful, but all good things.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I appreciate it. We're looking forward to having a discussion today. And yeah, it sounds like you've had a pretty busy year and kind of a lot of experiences, learning a lot of things, probably a little bit of a fire hose experience to some level for some things. So. But yeah, we're going to talk a little today about kind of your role and kind of thinking about wild turkeys here in the state of Nebraska. We can probably jump into some details a little later on about our wild turkey project we have here in collaboration with you guys at Nebraska Game and Parks and National Wild Turkey Federation. But yeah, looking forward to talking a little bit about turkey ecology. So to kind of get us started here, so within your role, I'll kind of get that started first. What is kind of your, I'm sure you're learning more of the day-to-day, but what does that kind of look like in your role of managing wild turkeys as a program manager here in the state of Nebraska?
Sure. So the summary of my job description is to analyze hunting and population data to ensure that we are responsibly managing the turkey population of Nebraska while providing quality hunting opportunities. What that looks like throughout the year involves a lot of Excel, a lot of conducting hunter surveys, and then presenting those findings, communicating them to the public via podcasts such as this, radio interviews, reminding people of safe hunting practices, and then presenting findings and suggestions to the Nebraska Game and Parks Board of Commissioners. A lot of times people ask me to change regulations. I don't have that power. All I can do is do my best science and present the most informed suggestion to those government-appointed commissioners who then have the vote on whether permit numbers or prices can change.
Yeah, no, and that's good. And I think that we actually had in one of our previous episodes in the past, Luke Meduna on and talked about his role. We were talking about deer management in particular. And that was one of the things we talked a lot about was just, how the permit allocation process work and just kind of understanding just some of that maybe behind the scenes things as you just alluded to. I think it's important because we need to be able to communicate that, yes, you're not making those decisions on, permit numbers. It's here's kind of the information, and then the commissioners are the ones that actually make those official decisions, which of course pointed to those positions. So, So,
is your position housed within the Nebraska Game and Parks then, or is it through the National Wild Turkey Federation, or how does that work?
Yeah, so it's wonderfully complicated. The National Wild Turkey Federation is my official employer, but the grant that I am working out of specifies that I am to function basically as a Nebraska Game and Parks employee. So I am paid by the National Wild Turkey Federation to work with Nebraska Game and Parks.
Yeah.
A lot of the positions within wildlife are
yes.
something similar to that, a little convoluted at times, it seems. So how did you get to this position? I mean, obviously, I'm assuming you went to school, maybe some college that got you interested in wildlife. Kind of talk us through that journey at how you got to this position.
Yeah, for sure. So I grew up being scared of science. I just assumed that I was bad at it. It took a somewhat uncommunicative high school science teacher that required me to teach myself the material. And then I realized that the subject doesn't need to be gatekept so much as do you have the curiosity and
Mm.
the willingness to work through the material.
That's
And
cool.
so I learned to love it. I learned that I liked sharing it with other people, helping them learn it. So I studied biology for my undergraduate degree at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln right here, focusing a lot on physiology and genetics. And then I knew I definitely wasn't done taking more classes in biology, so I went to Fargo, up to the North Dakota State University, and I studied songbirds and how songbirds align their reproductive timing with environmental favorability, and whether that is controlled by local adaptation, so the genes prevalent in certain populations, or if it's developmental plasticity, which is the environmental cues they experience growing up that then set that schedule. So I got to investigate that.
That's cool.
So that got me really into wildlife applications and ornithology. And then this job opened up. I was finishing a master's degree. I was engaged and moving back to Nebraska, and this seemed like a wonderful opportunity to gain management experience.
Sure.
Because in academia, as I'm sure you know, a lot of times, especially in more of the pure biology departments and less so the natural resources departments, but management implications can seem like this esoteric or distant thing that you have to write in your papers, but nobody really knows. It's just something you kind of have to write for grants. And so it's really been rewarding to dive into the implications section or aspect of biology and see, oh, yeah, I am communicating things that have direct bearing on population and hunting opportunity.
Sure. Yeah. And that's one of the things we do within our awesome lab. We've been really laser focused on that. Because like you said, you need to understand the biology of the species, period. But you also got to find ways to bridge that to our managers that are out and working across the state of Nebraska and beyond, and finding ways then in turn, we can work with landowners to implement things like, habitat management improvement, programs for, conservation enrollment, things like that. And so kind of translating that science that we're doing on the species back into actual management implications, as you alluded to. The other thing that's cool, and you mentioned about kind of the high school experience with a high school teacher, like that's cool for any parents out there or have kids that are maybe listening to this as well, is that, that pure curiosity is what I think drove a lot of us into what we do today of just the natural world. And so, if those are out there listening, they, really like science or kind of have maybe some interest in, going hunting and fishing and just kind of that interest of like, well, why do they do that? That's really what led me to where I'm at. And thinking about like, well, why do white-tailed deer make some of those decisions? Why do wild turkeys make those decisions? Like and then the more you learn about them, and then you start tying that to management implications, and you can work and have an impact at kind of a larger level. But again, it's that curiosity that really drives the science. So
Exactly. And I think it's important to also not be afraid of feeling stupid.
Absolutely. Yeah, I feel like that a lot of times. I just feel stupid.
Well,
There's days I'm like, I never thought of that. But it's honestly, I think that's part of this. You're kind of co-producing these things through time with our management agency folks, and I'm learning so much from them. And again, that's why I love having these very grounded, applied-based projects because I learned so much from the landowners and the biologists about what they are seeing day to day, and there's some things that they probably that they're obviously a lot more skilled in, and I'm like, wow, that seemed like a dumb question that I asked them, but it's helpful. We're all kind of co-learning together about the natural world. So yeah, that's a good point.
So obviously your schooling was kind of focused, or at least your grad work was focused around songbirds. When you moved back to Nebraska and accepted this position working with turkeys, was there a pretty steep learning curve trying to figure out that turkey ecology and how that all worked? Or maybe you had read up on turkeys before? The
ecology and biology are pretty similar. Turkeys are seasonal breeders living in the wild. The biggest learning curve was about hunting culture. I did not grow up hunting. My dad's pastime of choice was home improvement, so I know a lot about like hanging drywall and things like that, but knew less so about hunting coming into this job. So that's been fun to learn about, and particularly learning how conservation-minded the vast majority of hunters are. And there's a really deep respect for nature that a lot of them have. And I, growing up in Omaha and not interacting with people who at least talked about it a lot, wasn't expecting that.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a misconception around hunters quite often is that they're out there harvesting these animals. They don't really care about them. And that's in fact not true because when hunters start seeing these populations go down, they get worried, right? Mm-hmm. And they start saying, well, why is this happening? Is habitat disappearing? Is it disease? Or what's the laundry list of stuff affecting our species? So it's really neat to hear your perspective coming in and saying, hey, I don't really know anything about hunting, and then learning that. Because a lot of people, I think, choose not to learn that, or maybe, you know what I'm saying?
Right.
Yeah. That's a really good point. Yeah. And I think that, the more that I grew up in Pennsylvania, we didn't turkey hunt. So I've got into that when I was down in Mississippi, and then eventually moved up here. But it's just, it was culturally, it was just something we just didn't do. We deer hunted, small game hunted, and that was kind of the main things we did in our area. Plus our turkey population was so low, they had closed down the season for a number of years in our south central Pennsylvania area for turkeys. And so, but again, it's, that whether it be turkey hunters or deer hunters, whatever, that's one of the things that's exciting working with them about, kind of that passion. And I, as a deer hunter myself, turkey hunter now, it's getting outdoors and being able to find those opportunities just to kind of step away from the day-to-day, hustle and bustle of life, and then finding ways to ensure the long-term legacy of the species we're managing for, which I think from a turkey standpoint, they're one of those species that are very iconic for that restoration effort across the nation, and a lot of dedicated people who are passionate about ensuring that long-term sustainability of the population. So within Nebraska, you have some different subspecies of wild turkeys. Can you just briefly mention about what those subspecies are?
Sure. So we have the eastern wild turkey subspecies in the eastern half of the state, which is also in the eastern half of North America, roughly, as well as the Merriam subspecies, known for inhabiting more rocky areas and having the white tail feathers, and then the Rio Grande subspecies in southwest Nebraska, which is known for inhabiting more open, arid regions and having more of a metallic sheen to the feathers. I do need to caveat that these are very likely not pure subspecies.
That's good. Yeah.
Which is funny because I've noticed that a lot of times the managers and scientists seem really concerned about the genetic identity of these turkeys. And there's a lot of investigation going on into that because the translocation history has shaped the genetic patterns we see in these turkeys.
Sure.
But a lot of times when I'm talking to hunters might call me and say, I want to harvest a Merriam's. Where should I go? I have to say, well, you can go here, but I need to let you know that it is probably a hybrid with a game farm bird released decades ago. And they're like, almost every time they're like, I don't care. I want white tail feathers. So that's nice that hunters in general are maybe less particular than we might expect on genetic purity for the turkeys.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, and I know, because that's a big deal from kind of doing the Grand Slam and trying to find all the subspecies that you can potentially hunt. But then now I know Mike Chamberlain, some of their efforts with partners are working on that DNA project and kind of looking at the heritage birds, and kind of thinking about how pure are they? And really it's, most cases are not. Now, obviously some can be, but, especially in a state where you have 3 subspecies, there's a lot of mixing. And you mentioned game farm birds and stuff historically, interacting with them. So, yeah.
But that's just a side effect of what I would call a huge net positive of having 3 subspecies in Nebraska.
Sure.
That makes Nebraska very popular for non-resident hunters.
Absolutely.
Particularly those in pursuit of their Grand Slam, because if they're from particularly the southeast wanting to harvest all turkey subspecies, Nebraska is one of the states closest to them that you can encounter a Merriam's and a Rios, because we are right on that far eastern edge of their ranges.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, I have friends of mine down in Mississippi and other states that are always coming here to hunt.
Yep.
Because they want to be able to get that opportunity. And they love it, especially going up into the Pine Ridge and southwest Nebraska and stuff, just a different landscape than some of those southeastern states. So, yeah.
So here in Nebraska, like you mentioned, we have what we'll call subspecies just for the sake of our conversation. Right. They all kind of like different habitats, right? We don't need to nitpick the specific habitats of each specific subspecies, but can you go over just kind of the overarching habitat needs of wild turkeys across the board?
Sure. I would summarize it with variety, both in terms of vegetation and temporally. Turkeys are fun because they're requiring different vegetation, different habitat needs depending on the season and what they're doing in that season. So all adult turkeys need to roost. So turkeys can fly. I guess most people listening to that would know that because these are probably a lot of landowners and hunters, but some people are surprised by that. Turkeys can fly. They like to roost in trees. If there are not trees available, they are more prone to roost on your roof, which can be problematic. But yeah, they're preferring mature trees with a decent diameter at breast height for sleeping protected off the ground. Nesting vegetation is more roughly waist high, but it varies. Vegetation, a lot of forbs and grasses, so that females have that good cover to incubate on the ground, but can still stay alert and look out. And then brood rearing cover needs to be more open than people would expect. A lot of times I think people can lump together nesting and brood rearing habitat, but if you're a little baby poult, it's easy to get tangled up in pretty dense cover. So there does need to be some open spots so those poults can navigate and learn how to eat. And then winter habitat tends to be just more open areas because depending on the subspecies, the intensity of flocking behavior can vary. And so you can get those large aggregations that I'm sure our landowners in the West have experienced, for better or worse.
Sure, yeah. Well, and you mentioned, I have a couple thoughts on that. One is on the wintering flocks. I've had landowners say, well, how is there a turkey decline? Because that's part of something we can jump into later on, kind of turkey declines that are kind of across the nation. But like here, they'll see those huge winter flocks, and then they're saying, well, why? I don't think there's a decline of birds. And then it's like, well, in reality, what in our data really has shown this. These birds will disperse out of those winter flocks, and you could have a flock of 200 or maybe 300 birds, but that potentially is covering multiple counties, at least thousands of acres that those birds are going to disperse across. And so the point is that, yes, you may have a wintering flock, but they, are likely going to be, kind of occupying a lot of other areas. So one of the things I've always asked some landowners is, okay, you see them in the winter. Do you see them regularly around your property in the spring and then the summertime? And some of them say yes, some of them say no. And the ones that say no, I ask, well, like if you're interested in, turkeys, there's probably a missing link there of where you're at. And it's probably maybe there isn't, as you mentioned earlier about that nesting cover and the difference there in brood rearing cover. And so being able to, as you mentioned, kind of manage 365 it's just like ourselves as humans. You can't just take and survive on a suite of food in one season of the year. You have to take and think about that entire year and where you live and where you work and all that kind of stuff. So it's that 365-day approach. And I think that's where also it comes into working with your neighbors, your landowners, neighboring landowners, to be able to say, hey, maybe I have really good nesting cover, but you can maybe have across the fence high-quality brood rearing cover, and kind of thinking of the juxtaposition of them. So, but yeah, you're right. There's a lot of differences there, and I think it's important that, folks, know that there's, there's a lot of different needs for them throughout the year. So
yeah, that's all excellent points. And I do wonder if the perception of super large flocks in the winter is an artifact of of land use change. Like maybe a century ago, we know that a century ago agriculture was less intensive.
Sure.
So there was probably more hard mast, soft mast food from trees, more evenly dispersed throughout the landscape. Yeah. And so turkeys didn't need to gravitate towards this one grain hotspot that they found.
Yeah, absolutely. I bet you it is. I think there's definitely that conversion of lands over time is kind of facilitated that. And then what happens is probably, not to get nerdy on the biology, but there's probably some spatial memory then that's developed from generation to generation. So that's like, oh, well, this is what we kind of always have done. We've gone, like we think about some of the birds in some of our study areas, they have a wintering area and then they disperse. It could be 10, 15 miles away potentially to that nesting area and that kind of spring, summer range where they're going to be at. So and then they eventually come back to that wintering range, what our data shows. So there's probably some spatial memory there as well as they kind of learn that, and just it's a generational generational thing that gets passed down. But again, it's that conversion of lands, and they have to kind of adapt to that changing landscape through time. So that's a really good point.
What does the turkey diet look like throughout the year? Is it pretty steady, the same thing throughout the year, or is it changing with the seasons?
It is also changing with the seasons. Poults in particular consume a lot of soft-bodied insects, partly because they're gentler on their young digestive systems and partly because they are more protein-rich. And so that would be another selective pressure for breeding when it is warm because they can't thermoregulate as well as adults. So you want the temperatures to be more amenable, and you want good cover to hide them from predators, and you want them to have ample high-protein food supply, which would be those insects that are attracted to forbs and a variety of plants.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then so as they move into the winter, are they focusing more on grains then for just...
Yes. Yes. As those become more available and as they get older, and there's less of a need for protein as they are so rapidly increasing in body size. So you're getting soft mast, so fruit from trees, and hard mast, like nuts from trees.
Yeah, that's good. And I was thinking about that point on the kind of their diet. So what, just in general, I know we've had some discussions about this, but have you seen any data? You mentioned kind of landscape change. Have you seen any data about like potential changes in insect abundance through time?
Oh, I'm sure.
And just kind of thinking about like the changes in our agricultural intensification and how that potentially plays into diet of the birds.
Sure. So I have read papers on changes in the characteristics of insect communities, depending on crop type and pesticide use, and have read about changes in land use affecting turkeys. I have not read anything combining those two.
Interesting.
But yes. Yep.
That'll be a future opportunity for more.
For sure. A lot of papers by entomologists have been really on top of characterizing insect biodiversity and proving, look, these monocultures are not good for variety or for native insect species.
Yeah, that's good.
Which then trickles up through the food chain to, all of our birds, right? And game birds and songbirds and all things alike, for sure.
Yeah.
So the turkey, once it gets to its adult size, is a pretty large bird comparatively to other birds. What is predating, if anything, on our turkeys? Right.
So nest success is lower than humans would probably expect for turkeys. And it ranges from, I'd say 20 to 40 or 50% across the nation, which sounds horrifying to humans, but there's a bit of a bias biologically. We have different strategies. So turkeys, I would consider as more R-selected, which is to say live fast, die young. So they're having large broods and reproducing a lot because that high early mortality has selected for high fecundity, for making a lot of baby turkeys, hoping that some of them will live. Whereas humans, brown bears, large mammals, it's a different strategy. It's more what we would call K-selected. So you're having 1 to 3 cubs a year, or even every other year, but the chances of them making it to adulthood and passing on their genes is relatively high. So nest success for turkeys seems alarmingly low, but I think that it's just part of their strategy. As for what eats them, scavengers of nests can include possums, raccoons, foxes. A lot of that data can be difficult to discern, though, because a species is seen on a game camera doesn't mean that it was the one that ate the eggs, and it also doesn't mean that it was the reason the nest failed. You don't hear of raccoons. Like a lot of times people will say that raccoons predated the nest, but you don't see raccoons like mauling down a hen and slaughtering her. It's more opportunistic, where it's probably the female abandoned the nest or was gone on a recess from the nest and just encountered the eggs and ate them. So there's you can get into some semantics with predation versus scavenging, but a lot of your small mammals, your mesopredators, potentially snakes, are consuming those eggs and those poults when they are really young, particularly in those first 2 weeks of life before they can fly efficiently and take cover in trees.
Yeah, no, and that's good. And one thing I always tell people, especially in our working landscapes like Nebraska, I always use the analogy of, historically we had, you could say we had 10 restaurants in a town, that being your habitat patches. Now you have one. And so the usually it's, goes a lot to predation, and it's like, yes, that can be a component of it, but it's also a function of we just don't have a lot of habitat like we historically, and you alluded to that earlier. And so with that, we have to think about, and I love your point that, scavenging individuals versus ones that are actually predating that, because I think that does happen quite a bit. And unfortunately, one of the things I hear is, well, why can't you put a camera on one of those nests? And it's really hard. Our research has shown that it's very difficult to do that because they have a high abandonment rate compared to other birds. So people might think of like an eagle nest cam. It's a little easier there to do that, and the birds are not as worried about it. But in turkeys, they tend to abandon those sites if you would put a camera on that. And so therefore, it's hard for us to determine what is the exact species, and like you said, is it just simply happen to scavenge that because it abandoned it due to something else? There could be a whole variety of reasons, but at the end of the day, it speaks to habitat management and the need for that, because if we can provide more habitat out in the landscape, that takes pressure off of those nests and can take and spread that out to other small mammal communities and other species that are occupying that landscape. And so I think it's important that we think creatively about how we implement habitat management, especially in working landscapes where we're having to balance economics from the production side, but we want to ensure that long-term sustainability of our soil, water, and wildlife. So.
For sure. Yeah, I think it can be easy to blame those small mammals for declining turkey populations or just nest failure, but it's important to remember that turkeys and their predators or scavengers have coexisted for thousands, millions of years, but what has changed recently is land use and declining quality and quantity of habitat. Yeah.
That's good.
So you touched on eggs and poults and kind of what's going on there for predators. What are the predators for our adult birds, if there are any?
Yeah, so some studies suggest coyotes and owls. In fact, there was, I forget the name of the researchers, and that's not good. So you should Google this and read it so that they can get credit for this wonderful study. Attached accelerometers to adult birds. So would be able to track changes in the X, Y, and Z axes to determine kind of position in 3D space, and found that there were a lot of mortalities at night, and they could detect that because the XYZ coordinates kind of indicated that the bird toppled over at night, so when turkeys would be roosting, and in late winter, early spring, which is before green up. And so the authors suggested that that would be owl predations, because turkeys would be roosting in those trees, but it's before the leaves are providing them a lot of cover. Oh, sure. So that's what's happening there.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know during my PhD at University of Georgia, I worked with Mike Chamberlain, the Turkey Project down there, and we monitored predation as well. And I remember going into one of my first turkey. It was I believe it was a hen that was killed, and it was great horned owl had killed it, knocked it out of the roost. And the signature for great horned owl, for people out there interested in, if you happen to come across a turkey or out there on the ground dead, is they'll take and they'll first rip off the head of the bird.
Nice.
And then they'll take and it's like they fillet open, like you take a fillet knife for filleting fish, and they'll fillet the breast meat out. And it's very signature. You can look it up and you can Google it. A very signature pattern, and you can kind of see like the way they're plucking the feathers out, it kind of usually is like in a circular pattern right around the body of the bird. So it's pretty cool to see that, because I never saw it before in my life. And so, but that's, a signature of that. But yeah, you're right. That's been one of those things, a species that you're like, wow, I didn't think an owl could take an adult turkey out, and they absolutely can. Yeah. They're kind of like we like to say, like the silent killers out there that can fly in and knock them right out of a roost. So
I had a friend who referred to them as the serial killers of the woods.
Oh, there you
go. Less picky about what they'll eat. They'll kill almost anything.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. Yeah, that's cool.
Is disease ever a concern with our wild turkey populations?
Yes. Yep. So there was an avian influenza outbreak throughout the U.S., which, seasonally that tends to occur. But there weren't any reported in Nebraska this spring. But there were in Wyoming and Montana and nearby states. There probably were cases in western Nebraska that just didn't get caught. But yes. And actually, when I was trying to look up on USDA databases for national incidences of avian influenza, I would search turkey. All the results for Nebraska would be turkey vulture.
Oh.
Because I couldn't figure out how to filter out the vulture part. But yeah, again, so vultures scavenging birds, eating a lot of birds that died from avian influenza, and then they would get avian influenza. Yeah, so for avian influenza, that is an issue seasonally. I would say the most common issue that we see in turkeys in Nebraska is pox. So probably several landowners and hunters have seen turkeys with globs on their faces that look like warts. In varying degrees, some turkeys live just fine with only a few pox on their face or on their feet, but it can get really bad, really consuming, so that birds can't even really open their eyes. And yeah, so that can be an issue, as well as lymphoproliferative disease, which affects the lymphatic system. And that can sometimes look similar to pox disease, so you would need to necropsy to detect that. Yep.
Yeah, I'm actually glad you pronounced that, because I was trying to remember in my mind, how do I pronounce that? I can say LPDV.
Right, and honestly, lymphoproliferative is easier for me to say, because if I'm thinking of the acronym, I'm like LVDP, LPDV. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and you also, which we should get on the podcast at some point, we have Marnie Roundtree, who is a wildlife disease ecologist there for Game and Parks now. And so she obviously probably, I'm sure, is dealing with some of those cases, or at least if they do have cases come up of any disease-related birds, that's part of her job description, I assume. So
you could schedule a whole series with Marnie.
That would be
Every
fun.
time I talk with her, I learn something new.
That's cool.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yep.
Yeah, and she's probably, I think, somewhat similar in a sense to you, that fairly new, I think, to her role. So that's cool. That's awesome that the agency has a person like that now.
So correct me if I'm wrong. These diseases have been around for a while, right? They're not new, and they're not going to destroy our populations. It's something that they've been dealing with for hundreds of years.
It is something they've been dealing with for a long time. But again, if there's less suitable habitat that encourages these birds to congregate together, which can increase the rate of transmission. So just as insufficient habitat quantity can create predator sinks and make it easier for predators to find these birds, so can reduce insufficient food in the winter, creating those sinks of flocks congregating with farmers. It can also create these sinks of transmissible diseases, because all the birds are coming together, which is why during avian influenza outbreaks, it's common advice to remove your bird feeders for a bit, or just not put out bird seed, because that encourages birds to congregate across species, and that can increase outbreaks. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting kind of point to that, is that I was thinking, as you're mentioning about the congregation, there's also a lot of conversation right now around chronic wasting disease in deer going on around the country. And that's just a similar thing of thinking about a disease. What happens is when they're in greater congregation together, higher probability you're going to take and transmit that, just like anything else. Like if you had a cold, that's why you see kids in the classroom that tend to, almost like every kid ends up getting it, because they're in that classroom together. And so it's a similar idea that, that's where, as you mentioned, goes back to habitat. I like to harp on that quite a bit, because I think it's really important. Because we're trying to figure out offensive strategies of being able to best engage with our landowners around putting more habitat strategically on their landscape. And then that can help spread those species out, so they're not necessarily all congregated into small areas over time. So
for sure. Yeah. And I think it can be tempting to think, oh, well, I saw a bird nest here, so the habitat's fine. Yeah. Or I saw the birds congregate here, so it's fine. That means they're doing the best with what they can. Just because they're there doesn't mean that it's ideal.
That is absolutely correct. Yeah, and that's something I know it's we talk a lot about, like ecological traps. That's kind of essentially what you're referring to. Is could be a place that's attractive that in a sense they think that's, hey, this is all I got, and I want to nest somewhere, but then turns out that's actually not the best. And that's why we always say you want to not only just say just because we have like a GPS point or a series of GPS points there, it doesn't necessarily mean that's preferred. It may just simply be what you just said, and that's all they have, and therefore that's where they're at. And one of the things I wanted to go back really quick, and I wanted to mention, you alluded to this earlier with kind of the, with the different habitat types. One of the things that I see a lot, and you mentioned kind of thermoregulation for broods and for poults particularly. Typically, the first 2 weeks of life for those poults are going to be on the ground roosting with mom, and they typically during that same time frame, they're kind of basically their body's adapting, they're growing very fast, and so their ability to thermoregulate has not been established fully yet. Mm-hmm. And so what you'll see is if you have like an area of your land where say you have really thick brome grass, well, the bird can't necessarily get through there. Mom could get through there because they're a bigger bird. But thinking about, kind of, I always like to use like the analogy of like a baseball. Put a baseball down on the ground, and that's kind of what you have to kind of think of is, could I roll that easily through this cover and have that ball move quickly through it, or is it like having a lot of restriction on that ball? If that's the case, it's probably too thick for those poults, especially at that young age, because they physically can't get through there yet. And then if they get wet at nighttime and they can't thermoregulate very well and it gets cold, well, what happens? Then you die of hypothermia. And so then you lose those poults. So the point is that, like you mentioned earlier, back to the habitat, I think that's why it's really helpful to think about what your nesting cover looks like and how that does differ from what brood rearing cover looks like. So.
Yep, exactly. And it's funny that you mentioned baseballs, because when I think of poults, the sports item that I think of is those Nerf footballs.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
When they get older, they have the pointy butts, and they're kind of that shape and size.
Sure, yeah.
But yes, the illusion is absolutely correct of requiring habitat, especially in those early ages. And that actually, I think, explains a lot of our brood survey results for this year. So every summer, I sincerely appreciate the efforts of Game and Parks Agency staff, as well as just any Nebraska residents who would like to partake, to document the turkeys that they see opportunistically, so not going out searching for turkeys, just as they see, driving in rural areas, documenting hens, males, and poults that they see. And the numbers were still fine for a stable population this year, but reduced from last year. And Nebraska listeners might recall that we had unseasonably heavy and late rainfall this year, at least in the central and eastern part of the state. Sure. It was unseasonably heavy rain, and not kind of past April, past when you would expect a lot of that rain. And so I think that depending on when those broods hatched, they might have been unable to fly to roost to take cover. So then they're ground bound and get waterlogged and get too cold.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Well, and I think most folks probably think our birds are dying from the cold in the winter, not necessarily the spring when they're poults and they can't necessarily thermoregulate. Yeah. So that was neat to hear you bring that up. So would you consider, at least in Nebraska and some parts of the Midwest, turkeys are a success story because weren't they extirpated or completely removed from Nebraska and the Midwest at one point in time?
Yes. So it depends on the state, but in pretty much all states, turkeys were either locally extirpated, meaning just not found in that region basically at all, or populations severely declined for a bit in the 30s through 60s. And so Nebraska started reintroduction efforts in the early 60s from a lot of game farm birds. Some birds were from South Dakota too. And it's really fun reading these old articles because just the transactions that states had for transporting animals is pretty entertaining. Like I've heard of ptarmigan for turkey. One state gives ptarmigan, another state gives some turkey subspecies. I think Nebraska might have exchanged river otters for turkeys. It just,
yeah. I think we had that discussion on one of our recent
Yeah.
episodes.
yeah, so that was fun going through all these old documents and finding the reports, the pre-computer screen age reports
Sure.
where you can tell they were typewritten of
That's cool.
the going rate of otter to turkey.
What was the ratio? If you
I
remember?
forget, but I was paying less attention to the numbers and more to the denomination of the money. Was what
that's really
stuck
cool.
out to me.
Yeah, that used to be a pretty common thing. We talked about that with Sam Wilson, a recent River Otter episode about that kind of transactional process, and that seemed to be, and that was pretty common. It was a pretty common thing for a lot of agencies to do that as they were trying to restock different species in their state, and trying to revitalize those populations.
And we had Mr. Andel on.
Oh yeah, Frank Andel.
And he was a biologist at the time who was actually working some of these transactions.
That's right,
so it was pretty neat to hear his stories.
Yeah.
So they started releasing birds in the 60s, is kind of what you said there. Did they take off right away? Did it take multiple releases? How does that all work?
Definitely took multiple releases, and then also some serial translocations, so establishing a population in one part of Nebraska and then moving them to another part of Nebraska. And it did, I said the 60s, but this continued. Like, I found reports for Nebraska in the 80s too. So it was several decades of helping them establish. But the first turkey hunting season that was, official and regulated in the state was in the fall, and I believe in 1959.
Okay.
So
that's cool.
Yep.
That's really awesome.
Yeah, and then the spring hunt came later.
Yeah, that's really. So did that's cool to look at the historical perspective on it, because I think that's kind of helps people understand kind of that change through time. And then the population, from my understanding, in talking with Luke and looking at some of your guys' data, like really increased up through in the 90s into kind of early 2000s. And so you guys, you mentioned earlier, do brood surveys. Are there any other types of surveys that you guys are collecting data on outside of research projects?
Yeah, so we do the brood surveys in which anyone can participate, but then we also have these rural mail carrier surveys.
Okay.
Brian O'Connor, the upland game biologist, is more heavily involved with those, but that basically involves volunteers driving these historical, traditional routes that mail carriers used to take. I don't know if they still do, throughout the state in these rural areas, and documenting bobwhite whistles, rabbits seen, turkeys seen, pheasants seen, just a whole host of smaller game species. And so that has given us a good metric of turkeys seen per 100 miles driven, I believe, is the units there.
That's really cool.
And I think anybody can write in or let the Game and Parks know, at least somewhere on their website, if they've seen turkeys or a turkey brood in the spring. Is it right?
You can. We don't have a formal information request process for that, but there's a contact us box, and you can say that. We have depredation biologists too if turkeys are causing you problems in the winter. But the formal documentation process for citizen observations is during that brood survey in July and August.
Sure.
Yep.
So based on all the data you guys have collected, so once the birds got released, and I assume were they kind of released, we don't have to get into all the details, but like kind of released throughout the entire state at various locations, as I assume is kind of,
yes.
I don't know if there's any like target areas. They really emphasize more than others, but.
Yes, so if I am recalling the map that I found in some drawers correctly, most of the game farm birds were released along the Missouri River. Okay. And then more of the true Merriams and Rios were released where we see those today.
Oh, okay.
But then, they have since mingled.
Sure.
And everything.
That's really cool. So then the population, I assume, then just continued to increase through time. Was there kind of a peak then in which the population you guys kind of tracking, it's kind of got to its max point, and we're like a lot of states today are facing those declines, which of course necessitated some of the project needs.
Yep. So the population increased through the 90s and dramatically increased in the early 2000s, peaking in 2009, 2010. We think that corresponded with lower mesopredator or scavenger abundance and somewhat drier conditions. Obviously, drought isn't good for turkeys, but mild drought they can handle, especially then the poults are not being flooded before they can fly. Yeah, and then the population has somewhat steeply declined since then, from 2010 to about 2020. And we think that corresponds with increased rainfall and those predator numbers rebounding.
Sure.
And, of course, more really large monocultures increasing.
Well, and that's interesting, kind of the timeline that you laid out there, because I want to say it was around 2010 through 2012, 13. I mean, we saw really good commodity crop prices.
Yeah.
So a lot of perennial habitat, pasture land, grasses of that such were actually removed and put into row crop production. So out of all the other things you listed, we also had habitat acres going down at the same time, which doesn't help.
Right. Yeah, I didn't know that, but I believe that. And then I don't know the exact history of ethanol farming in Nebraska, but my understanding is that that's a bit of a more recent thing, that farmers have been growing more and more corn for ethanol the past 1 or 2 decades, which corresponds with that decline.
Yeah, I think it was in 2008, 9, right around there. I think is when I think it was actually 2008, because I think it's when President Bush had signed in for the act to start mass producing ethanol using corn, and that's where I had heard a lot of conversations, like a lot of CRP and other types of lands, as you mentioned, came out overnight, and were transitioned into production of corn particularly, and then obviously soybeans coupled with that as well. So that kind of is a good illustration of how markets change the landscape. And one of the things I always tell people is, we know there's challenges out there, and that's where our lab has been principally focused on. How do we take and help landowners change that game for their operation and think about alternative practices so that they can maximize overall profitability on their farm? Because one of the things we do see is in our ag systems, there's consistently areas of fields that are low yielding, that people are obviously losing money on that. And so finding ways that they can strategically target those practices in a way that's going to benefit their operation holistically from a production standpoint, but then connecting those puzzle pieces of habitat and landscape for turkeys and other species. So
yeah, and that reminds me of another interesting parallel. I mentioned that it can be easy to assume hunters are bloodthirsty or just in it for killing things when you don't grow up around hunters. Not that my opinions were that extreme, but I know people who just assumed, there's no good reason to hunt anything. And similarly, I think that it is important not to vilify our farmers and ranchers because they're feeding America, they're feeding the world. I love that America is just a low-key powerhouse for feeding the world. You don't really think about it a lot, but man, we export a ton of food, a ton of agricultural goods. And so, to not vilify farmers who are feeding the world and trying to turn a living and do things strategically is important. And likewise, if you don't know very many people who are working in conservation, I think the flip side is true, where if you grew up hunting and maybe owning land, it could be easy to think that biologists are all tree huggers. And not understanding struggles at all, and thinking that people are the invasive species. There shouldn't be farms. Everything should go back for the animals, and that's not true. Just the danger of echo chambers and realizing that conservation and economics and farmers' quality of life can work really synergistically.
I love that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's good to have you on saying this, because Andy and I have said it probably in every episode, so it's nice.
Not a farmer, didn't grow up hunting, still saying
it's nice having somebody else say
these
things.
I think it is important, because at the end of the day, there's, like you mentioned, echo chamber. I think that's a really big challenge in society, and we have today, and you can kind of get in your own little groups and and think this is kind of what I like to hear. But at the end of the day, we have to be able to bridge and co-produce these products with our landowners or conservation agencies. We got to walk alongside these individuals. And I know, Nate, you had some producers you're working with, and I remember one of them you mentioned about, like he had said, I just love that you're out here doing research. And I'm actually here to kind of be involved in this process. And I think that's cool because we need more of that. We need more people being able to be engaged, working alongside of us. But then also from our perspective, recognizing the challenges that producers are facing. It's not an easy one-to-one, basically equation for them. It's very complicated. They're weighing a ton of different factors. And so it's really important that people understand the complexity that producers are having to deal with. And it's not that, they don't want to do conservation. It's, does it pay out for me?
Right.
I can't be in debt long term. So, and they're not getting a paycheck, like we are potentially every 2 weeks or a month or whatever. They're waiting. If you're a, corn and soybean producer, you're waiting for the coming harvest to figure out, okay, now I got to take and back pay all those bills that I've had from fertilizer to everything else. And that's a risk. They have to take a lot of risks in that. So I think it's important that we kind of collectively talk about that. And that's really, to me, why we started this podcast as a whole, and thinking about ways that we can bridge that with folks that are working with turkeys or other species and landowners and things like that. So
yeah, exactly. I think it can be tempting to despair and think, oh my goodness, Nebraska is 97% privately owned, and so much of that is in agricultural crops, which is not the historical habitat of these species. But on the other side, that means that landowners have immense potential for good.
Absolutely.
Just immense influence. And it doesn't mean that you have to give up farming. It just, you have such powerful opportunities to do a world of good for the native species in your area. Yeah. Or non-native. Yeah. Pheasants,
Exactly. Hey, their habitat benefits the native ones too.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that survey numbers were a little low this year compared to previous years, but you said that we're still at a sustainable number is kind of what you mentioned, if I have that correctly.
Yes.
What number, put it in context for us, do we need to be at to have a sustainable population each year?
Sure. So for humans, for non-hunted populations, the understood replacement rate, which is how many offspring each female in a population needs to have to replace the members of the previous generation, is 2.1. And it's 0.1 because in humans, baby boys are slightly more at risk for dying as infants, and just some other things. There's just different sex-specific mortalities. So 2.1 is kind of a buffer average. And so that's why you see some countries in Eastern Europe and Russia having declining populations, is because the average woman is having fewer than 2.1 children.
Oh, sure.
Yep. Whereas in Afghanistan, it's like 5 children per woman. So we translate that to animals, and 2.1 poults per hen seen across all observed poults and hens and males in this season, in the summer during the brood survey period, is understood as a replacement rate. I think it needs to be a little bit higher because that population is hunted. I think that because we hunt our turkeys, and depending on the time of year, that can be more of an additive versus compensatory removal from the population. It should be higher than 2.1. So this year it was 2.1. Last year it was 2.6. Now there's a lot of caveats with this, right? Like the number of observations can change. Everybody differs in their ability to distinguish between a male and a female, or a female and a poult, which is why we do the survey in July and August, because if we wait until September, October, November, 1, it's during a hunting season, so that's altering their behavior, and 2, the poults can have gotten so big at that point that they can be difficult to distinguish from hens. So I think that it should be a little bit higher than 2.1, but I do know that if we stayed at 2.6 for several years, then we would be that isn't necessarily good. More isn't always better with turkeys, especially needing to balance landowner constraints, because people fantasized about the hunting opportunities in 2009, 2010 when the population was that high, but there were the pressure on landowners was more intense then because there were just more turkeys eating their crops.
Sure, yeah.
And just being annoying.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's the tough part of working in wildlife conservation is trying to balance all of these different interests, right?
Yep.
And figuring out that carrying capacity for the landscape, but then also what the landowners are going to put up with, what the hunters want.
There's a social carrying capacity too.
Bottom line is you're not going to make everybody happy.
No.
That's something you have to eventually just realize.
Yeah. And it's constantly changing. I mean, it's not like just plug and play with one factor and it's going to help. So.
And I think that's an important point because I think, I was looking here at the recent data came out, your guys' firearm season for deer. Not to keep going back to deer a lot. I notice we're talking about turkeys today, but it was a 7% decline in firearms deer season here in harvest. And some of that was obviously expected because permits had decreased. But then there's other factors. Drought was one of those things. And I think Luke Meduna, he had referenced that we're coming out of this kind of 3-year cycle of having drought. That in turn, it's going to, your populations don't rebound overnight.
Right.
And I think this is more of a philosophical kind of thing I've, been thinking a lot about is at the end of the day, we today in our society, because everything is at our fingertips and we can get it instantaneously, we expect instantaneous changes. We expect instantaneous change for the Husker football team that they're going to take and be national championship.
I expect more from the Huskers
but hey,
than I do from the
we
Turkeys.
have hope that in another year or two they can be there. But at the end of the day, it doesn't happen overnight. You have to build the infrastructure, and it's similar for wildlife. And then you mentioned, Nate, I think it's really important to also think the landscape is also changing. So there's so much that, especially from a state agency, you guys, you're not, you set the agency sets the regulations, the commissioners help with that, obviously. And once those regulations are set, it's really incumbent upon those landowners out there, because in a state that's 97% privately owned, if numbers are declining for certain species in a state that is dominant privately owned, that's kind of up to the landowners to find opportunities that they can boost those populations. And again, that goes back to some of these earlier discussions we had of kind of creating these or developing these creative avenues to help them optimize the economics for their operation, but understanding that an agency only has so much control, and that's all they can really do. They can set the regulations out there, but if we're losing habitat, it simply comes down to engaging and working with landowners and then finding those economic opportunities, take marginal acres and transition them to something different on their operation.
What do harvest trends look like for our birds here in recent years? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. They are slightly increasing over the past few years. And part of that is based on a spring permit reduction. So the turkey population spiked 2010, declined, stabilized, but at a lower than what it was for a few years. And then in 2023, regulations were changed to reduce the number of permits that could be purchased and the bag limit. So I believe it was changed from 3 permits per person to 2 in the spring. And then non-resident permits were capped at 10,000. So non-residents can still purchase up to 2 per person, but only 10,000 non-resident permits can be purchased total.
And they sell out pretty fast.
Less than 24 hours. Actually, I was walking over here. I had a call from a gentleman from Wisconsin. And we talked. He wanted to harvest a Rio, so I was telling him his best chances to find a Rio, which is in the Southwest, and I suggested Ender's Gap. But and then so we had a good conversation, and then I hung up, and I was walking for 2 minutes, and then I actually called him back, and I said, "Okay, you know about the permit cap, right?" And he said, "Yeah." And then I said, "Did you know that they sold out within 24 hours last year?" And then he got quiet, and he said, "No." So I said, okay, just sign up for the email notifications, set alarms, you'll be fine. You just got to get them quickly.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, they go. Well, that basically just illustrates also the excitement of people have coming to Nebraska, as you mentioned, having those 3 subspecies and just wanting to come hunt here.
Yeah.
It's a destination state for turkey hunting. So.
Yep.
So you said that harvest numbers were going up in recent years, but we know our population is going down.
Sorry, permit success.
Okay. I was going to say, is that a percentage overall?
Yes.
Okay.
So sorry. Per permit success, because we reduced the number of permits that people could buy. So based on email surveys, which have their whole host of issues based on the implications that you can expand from the sample of people who respond to the email survey to the whole pool of people who purchased permits. Of those who respond to the email survey, it is about a 53% permit success rate. And it is higher for non-residents, so it's about 60% last spring for non-residents, which again can seem alarming, but there's a lot of confounding variables behind that non-resident increased success.
Sure.
And one is that if you're new to turkey hunting, why would you pay 3 times more money to practice, basically, to learn how to hunt if you're still new at it? Whereas if you're a non-resident hunter, you are more confident in your abilities, you're more willing to invest and spend that money. And if you travel all the way to a state to pay more and be a non-resident hunter, you're more likely to stay until you shoot a bird.
Sure.
After investing all those finances and time, like, you're more likely to stay until you fill your tag.
And that's a good point, because I know individuals who get really frustrated about out-of-state hunters.
Yeah.
And I try to talk to them like, you don't know what they're bringing to our state.
Yep.
Not only are they paying more money for a tag, but they're staying in our local communities, spending money on hotels, food, gas. I mean, that's basically helping that rural community out, which is outstanding.
And that's a question that Chris Crowder, the biometrician at Game and Parks, and I added for the first time to our fall survey, asking, approximately how much money, excluding permit price, did you spend in the state of Nebraska, such as food, lodging, gas, equipment, anything besides just the permit and habitat stamp requirements, to estimate that.
Are you expecting to do that in the spring as well?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yep.
That'll be really interesting to see because I think you're absolutely right. I think that's a really important point that there's a lot of discussion. Well, why do we have all these non-resident hunters coming in here? But that's, they're going to a lot of these local communities, restaurants and hotels, gas stations and all that, and that's bringing money into those towns as well.
Yep.
So they're they're a part of the important equation, you could say.
Exactly. I think non-resident hunters are like fire, fire is great when it is contained for fireplaces and cooking and prescribed burns. It's when it's out of control that it's harmful. And I think I really appreciate our non-resident hunters. They're always polite when I talk with them, and just really appreciative. I think another thing that makes Nebraska attractive to other states is the simplicity of our regulations. A lot of other states, especially around the Great Lakes, the longer states like Indiana and Illinois, because they cross so many degrees of latitude, there's more phases and zones and different starts and different permit types, whereas Nebraska is just, archery for youth and adult. We don't care. That's March 25th. And then youth shotgun is the Saturday closest to April 8th. And then regular shotgun is the Saturday closest to April 15th.
Yeah.
And it's just, it is simple. And I think that provides hunters mobility to pursue subspecies across the whole state.
That's cool. Yeah. And so how does our season here, particularly the spring season, how does that stack up to other states? We talked about that the other day.
Yeah.
So
Nebraska has the longest spring season of all states that have turkey hunting. Yep, because archery starts May 25th, and then you have the other types of permits kicking off their seasons, and then they all end on May 31st. The average hunting season duration is about 38 days, and Nebraska's is around 70.
Oh, wow.
Yep.
So March 25th, the end of May. Wow,
the end of May.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
So when we reduce numbers, because again, we have a spring and fall season.
Yep.
When we're reducing permit numbers, are we reducing both spring and fall tag numbers, or one or the other, more in one, less in the other?
Yes and no. So I want to clarify, resident permits are not capped. If you're a resident in Nebraska, that is unlimited. You can purchase 2 permits per person. With non-residents, it's the 10,000 permits first come, first serve. But with residents, that they do not have that restriction. And then in the fall, we do not have permit caps, but it is 1 permit per person.
Okay.
And the bag limit of 1 bird per permit,
Gotcha.
1 permit per person. Yeah.
Do we see more birds harvested in the spring?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So spring 2025, according to our telecheck data, so the online system in which you can register your harvest, just shy of 10,000 birds were harvested.
Okay.
And then in fall 2024, it was about 480 birds were reported via telecheck. Yeah. Now, there is a discrepancy between birds reported via telecheck versus the number that we can get from extrapolating survey data, and there is some noncompliance. Sometimes, especially among older people, there's maybe not being aware that telechecking is mandatory, assuming that the email survey is fine. But reporting your harvest online or by calling telecheck is required. Participation in the email survey is not. This is for both the spring and the fall. So you can get different numbers for that. But this year, I just got the fall 2025 results. It was about 400 birds harvested.
Okay.
Yep.
So, that's pretty consistent. Only a difference in 80.
Yeah. So as we're getting towards the end here, I wanted to kind of highlight a couple quick things, and this kind of a teaser into subsequent episodes that we want to tape here in 26. And that's on our current wild turkey project that we have in collaboration with Nebraska Game and Parks Commission, National Wild Turkey Federation. What do you feel? We talked a little bit about some of the land cover issues. What are some of the biggest kind of research needs or challenges that kind of are tied to turkey populations right now here in Nebraska? And you think about our opportunities for future research as we kind of look down the road here in the next 5 to 10 years, and kind of where that turkey population is headed.
For sure. I think that the UNL study was a wonderful opportunity to gather baseline information, just really important. What are turkeys doing? What are the demographics, nest survival rates, survival over the winter, mortality from hunting, all of that. I think that was excellent to get that basic information. And from some preliminary results, I think a good next step would be the how demographic rates differ between environments in Nebraska. Particularly, there might be an impact of agrochemicals, so of pesticides, herbicides, insecticides. We have seen some differences in embryonic mortality between study sites, and I think that is worth investing because along with those differences, there's differences in land use. The area with less egg success is far more agrarian than where we saw more normal rates of hatching.
That's interesting, yeah. Well, I think it'd be an opportunity. I think there's a lot of, honestly, I think the more that I know I study turkeys, the more it's I feel like I have a million other unanswered questions. One of the things I really like to see, and what we saw out of our GPS data in particular, was seeing how far a lot of these birds are moving.
Yes.
And I think that's something that people don't necessarily always think of when they think of turkeys. They're thinking, kind of like they're thinking almost like the farmyard chicken. They're probably just going to hang out here, not going to go very far. But we have birds in both of our study sites in western Nebraska that would go anywhere from 10 to 20 miles. We even have one that went over 60 miles that ended up going from where we captured down the Trenton-McCook area the whole way over into Colorado, ended up nesting over there. Yeah. And she was actually a juvenile hen. So that was one that was interesting to me because she had no spatial memory of that landscape. Yeah. But when you zoomed in, you could kind of see the different, as you mentioned, trees being really important, the trees she would roost in at night, and then just continue on her merry way. And for whatever reason, she went to Colorado. I don't know why. But those are just interesting things. And then so the question I've always said is, okay, well, as you continue to understand their ecology, translating that to now maybe say eastern Nebraska, northeast Nebraska, southeast Nebraska, the Sandhills area, or kind of south central Nebraska, do you see similar behaviors? And then how do we kind of think about that kind of more targeted management in those different regions of the state as well? And then you mentioned earlier harvest data. I think that's another huge opportunity as well, as getting additional harvest data through banding studies and things like that.
Yeah, I think we learned a lot about female mortality just from survival, suggesting that fall harvest takes a more compensatory role because the cold in the winter is contributing to natural mortality for females in the winter. We know less about male mortality. I mean, it's pretty easy to conclude that hunting is playing a larger role in male mortality. But looking more at that, and then particularly how that changes depending on hunting pressure. So the Pine Ridge is, one of the most popular places for non-residents in Nebraska, probably the most popular. But so looking at that, and then with comparing birds in different regions of the Midwest or the state, it is tough because, again, you have those different subspecies. So Rios are going to wander more because where you see them in the American Southwest, that's what they do.
Yeah,
there's fewer roost trees. They need to travel more for that. So the question of how much of that is just Rios being Rios versus this is a serious need. This is a serious lack of trees. It's hard to deduce. I mean, that's the problem with all ecology is there's a whole landscape of confounding variables, but
yeah, that's true.
It does make for some fun problem solving.
Oh, absolutely. That's a good point.
You mentioned the need for agrochemicals and their effects on embryo development. Mm-hmm. Has any of that research been done anywhere else, or would that kind of be the first of its kind?
It has been done, but more with turkeys bred for meat, so domestic turkeys, and far less about the impacts of agrochemicals on turkeys in the wild. Most of them are with just poultry.
And I think, to that point, I think Nebraska is set up perfectly to look at how our agricultural practices are affecting our wildlife populations. I mean, we can be a proving grounds for a lot of other states that can then look in and see what we're doing and then go from there, which really excites me.
Yeah, and I found a graph of, or a map of pesticide use. I forget the specific one. It might have been atrazine. I forget. But some more corn-specific pesticides and their use in the U.S. and Iowa is basically completely covered. So I do think that Nebraska is uniquely situated to test this because we have corners where, because the environment is more conducive to ranching as opposed to farming, we can compare pesticide use. Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah. Well, and also there's obviously a big push for regenerative ag practices now. And so thinking about ways to maybe reduce some of them through time or find other opportunities to address that. I think there's definitely an interesting area for research for certain. So, yeah.
As we look to wrap the conversation up, what, in your opinion, what does the future of wild turkeys look like in Nebraska?
Promising.
Good. I like that.
I think it's promising. I think stable to slightly increasing, and the more we learn, the better we will be able to manage them.
Sure.
Without a doubt. Well said. Well, Carlie, first of all, thank you for coming on. I learned a lot today. And as these projects wrap up, I think we'll look forward to having you on again.
I'd be happy to. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thanks again. Appreciate it.
Thanks again. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Are you enjoying the Wild Ag Podcast? You or your organization can sponsor upcoming episodes that bring important information to listeners just like you. To learn more, visit our website, go.unl.edu/wildag.
Wild Ag is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network. If you enjoy this podcast, please leave us a review so others can find us and tune in.
And we want to hear from you. You can submit questions or topic suggestions to us at wildagpodcast@gmail.com. That's WILDAG podcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.